This is the second podcast about alcoholism. In front of me I have Andy F., who is presently writing a book about his experiences as an agnostic alcoholic. Hello, Andy.
Hi, George. How are you doing?
With regards to meetings attendance, AA meetings, what would you say to a newcomer who had just put down the alcohol about going to AA meetings?
Well, George, the suggestion of AA when you first come to meetings is to try and do 90 meetings in 90 days. It's a very good suggestion. It's a very positive suggestion. And the reason why they came up with the 90 meetings in 90 days is that a psychological study in America determined that it takes 90 days to break a bad habit. And let's face it, drinking alcohol is a very bad habit. And the only way that you can break a bad habit in 90 days is by replacing it with a good habit. Therefore, going to lots of AA meetings is a very good habit to develop, and it counteracts the very bad habit of addiction to alcohol.
So are AA meetings enough to recover from the alcoholic disease?
Well, initially for the newcomer, I would say that they just need to throw themselves into going to plenty of meetings. I don't think that too much should be required from them or demanded from them when they're new. It will probably take a few months for the alcoholic fog to clear. And then for them to feel a little bit more comfortable in AA. So initially, I would say to just go to meetings, plenty of meetings every day if possible, and to get 1 or 2 service commitments in AA to help the alcoholic to feel more involved in the fellowship. By service commitments, I mean something like making the tea, or making the coffee, or being a greeter at a meeting. And these service commitments are very good to help the newcomer to feel that they belong and to feel that they're a part of the fellowship. So in the early days, I would say to the newcomer, do a meeting every day, 90 in 90, get a service commitment, and then after 3 months, you can think about getting a sponsor and doing the program.
So what would you say to a newcomer about sharing personal stuff and sharing about your life in meetings?
Well, that's quite a controversial issue in AA.
Really? What?
Yes.
Why?
Because the big book on chapter 5, Bill makes a very clear statement about sharing our stories. What Bill says is that we share our stories in a general way. That means that the suggestion is that we don't get into too much personal detail and personal issues from the floor of an AA meeting. That is what other people are for, and then when you get a sponsor, that's what a sponsor is for. There's a lot of people that don't agree with that idea, to just share in a general way. Some people think that if you're having a crisis in your recovery and you're in danger of picking up that first drink, let's say you've just broken up with your girlfriend or your wife and you're upset, or you've just been made redundant in your job, these are very upsetting events. Then a lot of people would say that that's important to share those kind of things from the floor of the meeting, and I agree with them. I'm only partly in agreement with the fact that you shouldn't share too much personal information in a meeting, but if you're in a crisis and there's a danger of you picking up that first drink, I think that you should be able to share anything that you want to in a meeting, if it's going to prevent you from going out and relapsing.
So if you're a newcomer, is it more important to share, or is it more important to listen to other more experienced members?
Again, there's very divided opinions about that in AA. Some people, somewhat sarcastically, say to take the cotton wool out of your ears and put it in your mouth.
Okay.
Yeah. So you shouldn't really be sharing too much in a meeting. You should be listening, and that is a good idea. I think that for a newcomer, it's more important to listen to the experience of the older members than to start sharing. Yeah. Again, you can't generalize about that. If you're having a crisis, you should share whatever you want in a meeting. But certainly, I think that in the long run, listening to what's being shared in a meeting is more important than sharing in your early days.
And you've been in the AA Fellowship for many years. Can you tell us a little bit briefly what's the timeline of an AA meeting? How does it start and how does it end, and what's in between?
Well, in London, where I'm from, we used to have meetings that were 90 minutes long. And I really enjoyed the longer meetings because it gave everyone a chance to share, or it was just a good length of time. Then the idea of 1 hour meetings started to come in from America, because in America most meetings are only an hour long, and in London they started to develop that practice of having hour-long meetings. So an hour meeting is okay, but when I was a newcomer, the only place in the world that I felt safe and that anything made any sense was an AA meeting. So I appreciated the 90-minute meetings.
So how is the meeting starting? You introduce yourself and then share your thoughts, and then you end.
Every meeting across the world has a different format. In London, the secretary of the meeting would introduce the meeting, introduce himself. He would ask people to read readings from the AA literature, and then he would introduce the speaker. It was the secretary's job to find a speaker to share their experience, strength and hope at the meeting, and then the speaker would share for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then the secretary would open up the meeting for general sharing. But that format is different in different countries. Like, for example, in America, I was quite surprised to learn that in AA meetings they have a break in the middle of the meeting, a coffee break. So the secretary would introduce the meeting, the speaker would speak, they would share, and then after the speaker finished, they would have a coffee break for a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes, and then come back for the rest of the meeting, which would then be opened up for general sharing. So every meeting has a different format.
Around the world is different.
Around the world.
What's a home group, Andy, in AA?
A home group is a group where the newcomer is suggested to make at least 1 or 2 meetings their home group. This I learned when I was in a fairly strict group of meetings in London that were known as the Vision for You groups. It was suggested to newcomers that they get 2 home groups, which means that they attend the same meeting every week. Because in London there are 800 meetings a week. So it was suggested that you get 2 home groups and you get a service commitment at these home groups. And the reason for that is so that people have an opportunity to get to know the newcomer, to get to know you. And you have an opportunity to get to know them. So already there is a much stronger bond and a much stronger fellowship if you go to the same meeting every week. If you hit a crisis and you're thinking about going back out and drinking, then it's a good support structure to have a home group in which you are known and everyone knows you, and you know who to trust and who not to trust. So the idea of a home group is very good to ensure safety and security for your sobriety.
Can you have more than one home group?
Well, it was suggested to me by my sponsor David B in the Vision for You groups that we get 2 home groups, and I got 2 home groups, and he also suggested that I get a service commitment at each of these home groups so that I feel more a part of the meeting.
Service commitment, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
A service commitment is designed, the whole AA program is designed on service. It's to help the alcoholic get out of their own self-centered world, because when an alcoholic first stops drinking, he is by the very definition of alcoholism very self-centered in the early days, and very self-obsessed and thinking about himself. And so the idea of the service commitment is to help you get out of yourself by doing service at the meeting and helping the meeting. That might be very, very simple things like putting out the literature, putting the slogans on the wall, hanging up the 12 steps, making the tea or coffee, greeting people when they arrive at the meeting. It's all designed to help you to feel more useful and to help you to feel a part of the group.
I guess you guys, you don't go out for a beer after a meeting, but you might join out for a dinner or a coffee or a snack.
Well, it's really funny that you should say that, because in my early days in London, especially in those Vision for You groups, we had something called the meeting after the meeting.
Okay, tell us.
So the meeting after the meeting was that after the meeting had finished, a whole group of us would go to a diner or to Burger King or McDonald's, and we would sit there and we would share with each other and develop a stronger sense of fellowship. And it was actually a really good thing to have the meeting after the meeting. I made some really long-lasting and positive friendships with other members in the meeting after the meeting. Sadly, it's not as popular as it was when I first came around in the early 80s. Most people treat AA as just a program of recovery, where they come and they deal with their alcoholism and they treat their alcoholism and then they go home straight after the meeting. That's, in my view, unfortunate and sad, that people do not embrace the fellowship aspect of the meeting after the meeting, because it is a spiritual program and fellowship is very important to promote long-term sobriety and well-being.
So AA can both be a fellowship and a friendship on many levels.
It's a friendship, it's fellowship, but it's also a program of action, and it's very important to understand, for the newcomer to understand, that there is a huge difference between just fellowship and going to meetings and the program of action that is suggested in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. And that program of action requires a sponsor. It's impossible to go through the program on your own. You need a sponsor who has been through the program themselves to guide you through the first 9 steps of AA.
So how do you get a good sponsor? Are they offering help, or are you seeking one you like? Or?
Well, it's a skill. To get a good sponsor is actually a skill, because the plain truth of it is that not everybody in the fellowship is qualified to be a sponsor. Some people are just not far enough in their own journey through the steps to have very much to offer as a sponsor. So what I would say to a newcomer is, before just going to a meeting and asking someone to sponsor them, to get to know that person a little bit first, to find out a little bit about them and their history. It's not even a bad idea to ask other members that know the person you're thinking of asking their opinion about that person's competency to sponsor. Yeah. So what I would say to a newcomer is take your time, get to know people at the meeting first, get to know each individual member before you ask someone for sponsorship. If you really like what someone has got and they're clearly happy and contented and enjoying their sobriety and they seem very much on the program, then it's a good idea. It might be a good idea to ask them for sponsorship. The other thing that is very important to mention is that I wouldn't ask someone to sponsor me unless I knew they also had a sponsor.
Oh, so you mean it's a pyramid?
It's a pyramid. It's a pyramid. It's very important for me that my sponsor also has a sponsor and is continuing to take guidance and direction from their sponsor. And the reason for that is that if an alcoholic starts sponsoring himself, he's being sponsored by a lunatic.
So I guess during your many years in AA you have had many sponsors and many sponsees as well.
I've had many sponsors. I've had a few sponsees, not that many. Initially, I wasn't interested in sponsoring anybody because I was still very unwell and I was very self-centered, and if you want me to be honest, I was too selfish to care about anybody else's progress but my own. So I didn't sponsor for a very long time in AA, but then I learned somewhere along the line that in order to keep your recovery you have to give it away. And that has been a very important lesson for me, is that if I want to maintain any type of emotional sobriety, I have to give it away to the newcomer and help them through the steps in the same way that I was helped through the steps. It's all about love and service.
So AA meetings is not enough to recover. You need a sponsor. You might need to sponsor other people. Is it something more to be successful?
Well, as I said, in the early days, all that's required is that you go to meetings on a daily basis, if you can get to one. Yeah.
And if you get lazy or you're busy with other stuff?
Well, there is a danger. If you're in your early days, if you don't get to a meeting every day, there is a danger that being alone and isolated, your negative thinking, the negative alcoholic thinking, will start trying to convince you that picking up a drink might be a good idea.
And that's not a good idea.
And that's not a good idea. So there is a very humorous saying in AA that an alcoholic alone is in bad company.
Okay.
So it's a good idea to get to a meeting.
Have you ever stopped going to meeting because you're tired of it or you didn't like it? Or
many times, George. Many times I have balked on the program. Balking is a very interesting word. It's not a very well-known word, but balking, B-A-L-K-E-D, means suddenly stopping taking any guidance or suggestion, rejecting the program, firing your sponsor, and deciding that you're going to start running the show of your life again. And when I did that, and I did that many times in my 36 years of AA attendance, I ended up either relapsing or very miserable and going on something that is known in AA as the dry drunk. An alcoholic alone, when he listens to his thinking and stops being teachable to the suggestions of AA, goes back to untreated alcoholism and a very negative state of mind. And what drives that dry drunk is the maladapted alcoholic ego. And as long as we go to meetings, we are on some level remaining teachable, which is a very good thing. But the minute that we reject meetings and start thinking that we can do it on our own again, then sadly the ego kicks back in And a lot of alcoholics go back on a dry drunk, and in my case, that ended up in relapse many times.
So you're saying that regular meetings attendance, it helps to stay away from the alcohol. But is it enough to go to meetings? Is that the solution?
No, I made that mistake. For my first 13 years in AA. All I wanted to do was to go to meetings. I wasn't interested in sponsorship. I wasn't interested in the steps or the program. And as a result of that, I relapsed many times in my first 13 years of going to AA. And sadly, a few of those relapses almost ended tragically for me, because drugs are a part of my story as well. And I overdosed on hard drugs after many years in AA, and I almost died several times. So it's not enough just to go to meetings.
So how about emotional sobriety?
Emotional sobriety, in my experience, cannot be achieved by just going to meetings.
So what do you need more?
You need a sponsor. You need to surrender to the suggestions of a sponsor, provided he's a competent sponsor. And you need to start taking guidance and go through the program. The 12-step program, is designed to help us to recover from the spiritual illness. And that in itself is a whole different podcast. What is the spiritual illness? But in a very abbreviated form, untreated alcoholism may be seen as not only an addiction to alcohol and powerlessness over alcohol, but also the alcoholic's thinking becomes so distorted without a program of action that he can start getting into all kinds of self-destructive behaviors. And that's why another expression for the disease of alcoholism is the disease of perception. The steps help us to address the distorted perception of the alcoholic mind.
Okay. I've heard the expression getting into the middle of the AA bed. What's that?
This is an expression that was suggested to me when I had my last relapse. I knew that if I didn't do something very radical about myself, that I was going to die. It was as simple as that. I was under no illusion that whatever it was that was inside of me was out to kill me. And it's the disease of alcoholism. It was out to kill me. So it was suggested that it wasn't enough that I just go to a meeting and sit at the back of the meeting, come to the meeting late and leave early and sit at the back and not talk to anybody. It was very important that I get involved. And so I was told about the expression, get into the middle of the AA bed. Well, that's the only place, especially in your early days, where it's safe, is to get totally involved and in the middle of the AA bed. Because if a crisis happens, you're a lot safer in the middle of the AA bed than if you're on the side of the bed where it's so easy to fall out on the floor.
Okay. I'm getting a little bit confused there. So what's the primary purpose of an AA meeting? It says here in Tradition 5, you showed me, each group has but one primary purpose, to carry the message to the alcoholic who still suffers.
That is a very controversial issue in AA. The more hardcore, hardline AA members that have a more fundamentalist approach to recovery believe that our primary purpose is to carry the message to the newcomer. And therefore, when they share in an AA meeting, they should share not about their own personal problems and their own personal struggles, but they should share a message of hope to the alcoholic who is still suffering. And that is the purpose of an AA group. And then there's another camp in AA that will tell you that that's nonsense, that the purpose of an AA group is for everybody to share what is going on with them honestly. And if you're having a problem in your life and your sobriety is in danger, then you should be able to share whatever you want to share in a meeting. And I'm inclined to agree with that, is that if you're having a crisis and you're about to walk out of the meeting and have a drink, then you should be able to share whatever you want to share. I do believe that there's wisdom in what Bill Wilson said about sharing your stories in a general way, to share in a meeting in a general way, because the plain truth of the matter is that there's a lot of people in the fellowship that are in early recovery and they're still very unwell. And if you start sharing very personal material in an AA meeting, someone who is very unwell may use that material against you and may use it to manipulate you. For example, if a lady, a newcomer who's a lady, begins to share very vulnerable stuff in a meeting, then obviously there are predators in AA who may try to take advantage of a female newcomer and use whatever they share in a meeting as an opportunity to exploit them sexually, or take advantage of them in some way. So I think that one has to learn to be discerning about what one shares in a meeting. But is it the primary purpose of an AA group to just share for the newcomer? I don't think so. I think that we all need to be able to share whatever we need to share.
Do you sometimes get upset with each other, start bickering and fighting, or can that happen as well?
Well, there is something in AA called cross-sharing, and this is quite strictly discouraged. If that's a problem in a meeting, they normally include that in the preamble, and they make the whole meeting aware that there should be no cross-sharing in meetings. What cross-sharing is, if someone gives an opinion or makes a comment about what someone else has just shared in the meeting. The AA meeting has to be a safe place to share. And if someone is given, if someone cross-shares and makes a judgment or a comment about what someone else has just shared in a meeting, the meeting is no longer a safe place. So I've seen many conflicts and many arguments in meetings where people have got up and stormed out of the meeting because someone has judged them because of what they've shared. So I really believe that we do not cross-share in a meeting and give our own opinions about what someone has shared.
So what would you say to a member if they have had a very difficult event and are going through a very hard time?
If someone is going through a very hard time in recovery, then it's crisis. It's a crisis, and that crisis has to be dealt with in whatever way is appropriate to help the person not pick up the first drink. And if that means dumping all their pain in the meeting and sharing about how dreadful they feel or how angry or how upset they are, then I think that is entirely appropriate.
So what happens if a disturbed member start to threaten or intimidate?
Oh, well, that's a different story. That's a different story. This is the purpose of what we have in AA, which is known as the group conscience. It's everyone's right, every member's right in an AA meeting to call a group conscience if there are behaviours in the meeting from which they feel threatened or intimidated. If someone is menacing or threatening or judging, then that person is completely entitled to call a group conscience. And the group conscience, which is a group vote, everyone has to vote. If the vote is in favour of the person who has called the group conscience about a particular person in the group that is being threatening or intimidating, then that person can be excluded from the group.
So you just break the meeting and start a conscience?
Yes, you can call an emergency group conscience, yes.
And that happens?
That happens, I've seen it happen.
And is just going to AA meetings enough? We was mentioning it a little bit before, but what else does AA offers beside the support of the AA group?
The plain truth of the matter is that our addiction to alcohol is only the first part of the problem. We have to, as the big book tells us, we have to get down and deal with the causes and conditions, to quote Bill, of our drinking. Why did we drink? What are the things in our characters, our personalities, that drove us to drink? For many alcoholics, it's resentment. For other alcoholics, it's self-centered fear, self-pity. These issues have to be addressed through the 12 steps. Some alcoholics are very obsessional, and they get obsessed about different things in their recovery, and they develop new addictions. When they put down the alcohol, they develop addictions to food, to sex, to codependent, unhealthy relationships, workaholism, working and just making money, and that's not going to get them spiritually well. If you believe that alcoholism has its roots in a spiritual malady or a spiritual disturbance, then the only thing that will treat the disease holistically is the 12 steps. And so just going to meetings, I did that for 13 years in AA. I just went to meetings and did a bit of therapy on the side, and that wasn't enough to keep me sober.
You are a long-term AA member, and you don't believe in God. And now you're writing a book. Can you tell us?
I don't believe in the traditional idea of a monotheistic God, no. I was raised in a Catholic family with a foster mother who saw herself as a very strict Catholic, and her attitude and behaviour towards me was most unfortunate. So at a very early age I developed resentments towards religion, because she was talking about the love of God, and her behaviour towards me wasn't great. And then I was sent to a boarding school, a Roman Catholic monastery boarding school, where I had also some quite negative experiences with religion. And so I rejected at a very early age the idea of a traditional monotheistic God. That doesn't work for me. What I had to do is to find alternate higher powers in AA that were a sufficient substitute for the traditional idea of God.
Alternative God?
Yes.
Or another option? Or how?
Well, in AA they give you the option of having a higher power. A lot of people in AA view their higher power as the idea of a divine deity. In my case, that didn't work, and in fact, I struggled for many years because I couldn't get my head, as an agnostic, I couldn't get my head around how a higher power could work for me. And then I was very fortunate to get a sponsor who told me that if I made AA itself my higher power, and the suggestions that he gave me and the program of action as described in the 12 steps, all of these things were powers greater than me. And so when I realized that higher powers need not be God, but practical suggestions, and AA itself, then my recovery really took off.
And now you are writing a book about this.
I'm writing a book about my experiences, because the plain truth of the matter is, George, is that I found the God word so daunting in my early recovery that I used the God word as an excuse not to do the program at all. I was aware that the God word is mentioned in 6 of the 12 steps, and so I thought, well, the steps are not for me, it's a religious program. Every other step talks about God, so I wanted nothing to do with it. I almost paid with my life with that attitude, and so I had to do the steps. I'm not someone that had to do the steps, and I found a very practical and I was shown a very practical and positive way of going through the steps without using God as a higher power.
So your book, how can we learn a little bit more about that? How do we Is it ready? Can we order it?
Not yet. It's in the final stages of editing. It should be open. It should be available in the second half of this year, and it will be published on Amazon. And I hope that it will be a useful resource to anybody who comes to AA and can't digest the traditional idea of God.
So how can we find Andy? On your website and on Facebook, I guess?
Yeah, you can find me on my website. My website is AA for Agnostics. www.aaforagnostics.com, and my Facebook. There's a link to my Facebook page there as well.
AA for Agnostics at Facebook, right?
Yes.
Okay. And of course, if you listen to this podcast, you probably come somewhere from YouTube, where we are posting this podcast, and this is the second podcast about alcoholism. So what can we wait for? The next issue of the podcast, what will we be talking about?
Finding a good sponsor.
Wow.
I think that's a very important topic. Yeah, for anybody that comes to AA, it's absolutely crucial that they find a sponsor that has the skills and the competency to take you through the program in a loving and spiritual way. Otherwise, the steps just won't work. So rather, many alcoholics, when they come to AA, are reckless, impulsive, impatient, and they want to get a sponsor as quickly as possible. I think that could be a mistake. It's very important to find a sponsor that knows how to take them through the program, as I said, in a loving and supportive way.
Thank you, Andy F., for coming to the studio today.
My pleasure, George. Good to be here.
Thank you.